Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Pete's CD and Vinyl World. Today I wanted to do a video in which I might start doing a series of videos for bands that have 3 great albums in a row. Got this idea from Chris Profi. He did, I believe, a couple of these a while ago, and not sure if he's done any recently, but I think it's a good idea. So, I guess obvious concept is bands that put out 3 great albums in a row. Either it could be a combination of studio albums or live albums or whatever, but I'm going to do them so they're actually three albums in a row. So not just 3 studio albums, but for example, if you were going to do Kiss, you could do Rock and Roll Over Love Gun and Alive 2, or Alive, whatever combination you want, as long as they're in order. So today I was going to do Toto. And, not exactly one of the VC's favorite bands. In fact, I've never heard anybody else mention them at all, ever. And they're actually one of my favorite bands. They, best known for a few of their late 70s, early 80s hits, Hold the Line, Africa, Rosanna, and a couple other minor hits. But in reality, when you look at their catalog, they actually had a lot of hits through, I would say, even to the late 80s. At a certain point, they became more of an adult contemporary band, you could say. But the 3 I'm going to go over today are their first 3, which are Toto, self-titled, Hydra, their second one, and their 3rd album, Turn Back. So, like I said, Toto's a band that's sort of brushed off as this corporate, cheesy, the opposite of what Rolling Stone and Jan Wenner and his cronies would like. It's cool to like the Talking Heads. It's not cool to like Toto, But anyway, a little bit of background. The core band, which is David Paich, Steve Lukather, Jeff Porcaro, Steve Porcaro, and eventually Mike Porcaro became the bass player. David Huntgate plays on their first 3 and half of Toto 4. But basically, Steve Porcaro, David Paich, and Steve Lukather were studio musicians, sort of the 70s version of the Wrecking Crew. They played on so many albums during the 70s. In fact, David Paich actually wrote some of Boz Scaggs' hits before the first Toto album was out. So they eventually got a record deal and put out their first album, Toto. And this album, known probably best for Hold the Line, and I'll Supply the Love. Girl Goodbye, I think, was a minor hit as well. This is probably my favorite album from Toto. It's just an all-encompassing album as far as styles. There's rock, hard rock, a little bit of prog, even like some disco hinge, a little bit on I'll Supply the Love. There's an instrumental, Child's Anthem. Sound-wise, performance-wise, it's really great. Yeah, I mean, every song from top to bottom is really good on here. Highly recommend it. One of my favorite debut albums of all time. And for some reason, they decided to follow that up with sort of a prog album, Hydra. It's not really, I wouldn't say it's prog, but it's known as the Toto Prog album. In fact, this came out in '79, in which prog was pretty much not dead in the water, but Yes and Genesis had already started to move in a more concise, shorter song direction. Album only has 8 songs. Again, another great album from top to bottom. The title track, St. George and the Dragon. The minor hit off of here was 99, which is a ballad sung by Steve Lukather. All Us Boys was a pretty good rocker. Favorite song on here is probably White Sister. Really long jam guitar solo at the end. For those who don't know, Steve Lukather played on an endless amount of hits. Everything from Boys of Summer from Don Henley. He played on Toto. I'm not Toto. Michael Jackson's Thriller. In fact, on 3 or 4 of the songs on Thriller, Jeff Porcaro, David Paich, Steve Lukather, and Steve Porcaro is basically the backing band. Like on Beat It, everyone knows that Eddie Van Halen played the guitar solo, but Steve Lukather played all the other guitars and actually wrote the riff. I don't know if he ever got writing credit for that. But anyway, getting back to this, like I said, great album from start to finish. Odd thing about this album is their lead singer Bobby Kimball, I believe, only has like one song where he sings lead vocal. There's songs where he sings lines here and there, but most of this album is sung by David Paich. I think he wrote most of the songs. Steve Lukather sings a couple, but again, great album. So after this one didn't do that well sales-wise, the record company told them, try to do an arena rock album. So they came back with Turn Back. This came out in 1981. So again, a great album from start to finish. Only 8 songs, but Bobby Kimball is involved more with this album. The somewhat semi-hit on this album is Goodbye Eleanor, and to me that's my least favorite song on the album. It has good performances and good musical parts, but it just never grabs you and never really goes anywhere. English Eyes to me should have been the single off this album. Probably would have been a bigger hit. But again, great sounding album. Like I said, 8 songs, but every one of them is great. So those are my 3 for the 3 great Toto albums in a row. And you might be like, well, why didn't you do something to include Toto 4? You know, but I couldn't leave out the first album because it's... So, obviously, their next album was their biggest album, Toto 4. Won a bunch of Grammys for this, has Africa and Rosanna, 2 of their biggest hits. This album, as well, is very diverse. A lot of the prog elements that were on their first 2, even in the third one, which is known as their Arena Band album, that completely seems to disappear by the time you get to this album. This is the album where they have more of that adult contemporary feel and more of what, if you ask somebody who's not really a fan, what they think Toto would be. Which is not a bad thing. But again, there's some great songs on here. Afraid of Love, that Steve Lukather sang and wrote, is a great rocker. Of course, Rosanna and Africa. This was Bobby Kimball's final album with the band until he rejoined in the late 90s. But, you know, this band never seemed to have any luck. They didn't tour for this album. And by the time they toured for this album, their sort of momentum went away. They won a bunch of Grammys for this, so including Album of the Year, etc. So they never, for that reason, to this day, Toto, even though they have a lot of hits, more than some of the other classic rock bands that tour every summer in the outdoor amphitheaters and stuff, Toto never established themselves as a big touring act in the U.S., which is unfortunate. Supposedly they did break up after their final tour, but some of these new Facebook Live posts from Steve Lukather, maybe they are going to get back together next year, who knows, but... So after this, here's another mistake. Bobby Kimball leaves the band, and then they put out Isolation. Again, very good album, but now this is more of an 80s sounding, not as organic sounding as this album. It has a lot of the 80s production. And they have a new singer, Freddie Fredrickson, I think his name is. It's the only album he did. Again, they barely toured for this album, I think, in the U.S. After this album is where Joseph Williams joined, and they put out a couple albums with him, and that's where they really went. This album is known as their one of their heaviest albums. I don't see it that way. I mean, there's a couple songs that are pretty heavy, but overall, it reminds me of, remember Mr. Mister? That type of AOR rock. That's what this reminds me of. There's a couple, like I said, Isolation is one of my favorite songs from them ever. After this album, they put out Fahrenheit and the Seventh One, which are definitely more adult contemporary. Actually had some hits off of that, those albums as well. That was with Joseph Williams. After that, in the 90s, basically Steve Lukather took over the lead spot in the band. They put out Kingdom of Desire and Tamboo. Again, huge albums the rest of the world. They were a huge touring act. The head of Sony actually hated Toto, so they prevented their albums in the 90s from coming out in the US until like 6 months later. So they wouldn't promote them at all, even though they were an arena band in the rest of the world. So they've had some bad luck over the years that way. But they're one of my favorite bands. I didn't want to do a ranking of the albums because I still need a couple of their albums they've put out in the last 20 years or so, but hopefully I'll get them soon and do a ranking of their albums. But I highly recommend all of them. I love Steve Lukather. He's one of my favorite guitar players, like I said. You know, he's played on stuff probably you don't even know it's him. In fact, I would guess, like, besides the Wrecking Crew and maybe like Paul McCartney, I would think Steve Lukather probably played on more top 40 hits than almost any session musician. Or maybe like Lee Sklar, I think, that bass player with the long beard. Anyway, what do you guys think? You like Toto? Probably not, right? Most of the VC is going to be like, no. But anyway, if you like these videos, please subscribe, and I'll talk to you later. Thanks.